It's a great honor and pleasure to be part of this webinar, and this goes without saying. It's still better to say it, but let me substantiate. It's always educative and it's always thought-provoking. I haven't counted the number of webinars organized by the MRC to which I've been happy to be part of, but each time I deepen my understanding of the concept of underwater domain awareness. And each time I realize more how it connects to what is missing and the gaps which Commander Das was mentioning in the action. So it may be of my slow understanding, but I think it more generally calls for pedagogy, and I'm very thankful to MRC to be relentlessly conducting this pedagogy on this very important topic, which is key to the sustainability of our planet and the future of our children. Pedagogy is key in new concepts, and it's very interesting to see that we have a new concept, or at least a concept which comes from a domain in particular, which is the domain of naval security, and that percolates into ecology. I had prepared a talk for today, but based on the intervention of my dear friend Arnab Das, who mentioned that we still lack action in the international community on the UDA framework. And based on what we just heard from the UNESCO, allow me to kickstart new ideas and to kind of think aloud. You will excuse me, but to testify that your webinars are always thought provoking and can lead to action. I would want to put a couple of points. The first point is my understanding of where we stand in the international community on climate change is that we're at a turning point. We're not just at a turning point because the degradation to environment is accelerating, but because we start understanding that all those effects are just one cycle and one element. As was said in the presentation by my predecessor from the UNESCO, climate change is not just the weather changing. It's a chain. He mentioned it's a long-term chain, but it's a long-term chain on which we have already short-term dangerous, frightening effects, but it's a long-term chain between all physical elements of the planet, including livelihood. And I think we are rediscovering that after having, I don't say if it's lost or invest in 10 years, but if you look at the Paris Agreement, or nearly a decade, if you look at the Paris Agreement was triggered on climate, was triggered because early modeling on climate change mentioned that the climate is changing. But if you look at those modeling, the physical basis of that was to model the interface between the sea and the atmosphere. And we humans have forgotten the sea in between over the last decade. This modeling has come to express the changing that we face as originating from this interface. This is how you model weather forecast and weather and climate. And all the actions, or most of the actions that have been put out of the Paris Agreement so far have started with carbon in the atmosphere, not so much thinking about oceans, about reduction of the carbon in the atmosphere, which is mitigation, and not so much the impacts and adaptation. So, there have been different agendas. No agenda has been forgotten, so to speak. But we've started, when I say we, mankind has started with the tools we had. Mankind masters energy, so we started with energy. It was easier to measure carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we started with that. It was more complex to analyze the ecosystems, and I was happy that the UNESCO mentioned about the Earth ecosystem, even though today we talk about the oceans and the UDA. But the more we understand, we have systemic thinking about the Earth ecosystems, the Earth living ecosystems, how soil is a living element, how soil is a living capital. In fact, economists tend to think that capital is something you exhaust or resources you tap into or which you accrue, but only when it's financial capital. Soil, forest, a resilient agriculture, a resilient ocean, a dynamic, active, living ocean has, if you want to treat it as new innovative economics, for instance, has a potential of accruing natural capital. And I think that we're having this loop, this long journey, which took us away from the fundamentals of life and of ecosystems, which brings us back today to that. I'm not sure if it's the hopeful, optimistic speech on this very particular day, but I think that the journey has been long, and the fact that the workshops that Amansi is conducting multiply and gain impact and audience and actions speak for itself. I would want to conclude this first reaction on which is linked to the systemic thinking before moving to my second reaction on quoting a book by, you will be surprised, Richard Feynman. Richard Feynman was a physics Nobel Prize. This book happens to be in French, but the original was in English, of course. This book is the book based on his teaching of physics, fundamental physics, in California University in 1962. This book is important because in 2 chapters, he explains the whole of physics in 2 chapters, including biology, including ecosystems, of course, with a snapshot, based on atoms. This very simple idea of atoms explains everything. Atoms exchange energy at the surface of water and the atmosphere. Atoms might exchange electrons or protons. When it's protons, it's acidity. Some of those elements, some atoms, some molecules, or some protons enter the cells of living organisms and they live and prosper out of it, or they die. And what we humans, through our systems, through our economic system and technology systems do, is we have an influence on those atoms, which have an influence back on us. The very first 2 chapters by Feynman are very, very, very illuminating and can have any layperson grasp physics, the unity of the physical world in which we live in. Why am I quoting Feynman? Because I'm pretty sure that should he be doing his masterclass today, should he write his book today, he would add the environment. He would have the systemic thinking about the environment. And why am I quoting that is just to make us even more hopeful that this can work. Because sometimes when we say that everything is interconnected in the environment, we think like it's going to be horribly complex. We're in societies where we can treat problems as we've analyzed problem, put them into a silo, found the technological brick, adapted it to some social issues, and treat it in semi-silo, connecting it to some others. But we spend a lot of time in the connection. And we think that we perceive that the systemic thinking is pretty arduous. This is what physics has been doing for the last 60 years, 80 years, 100 years. So what a science, which is the core of all the technological developments we have, has been able to do for a century, well, the technological developments that we have can be used in a systemic thinking. And I think the key issue is education, education and education. And that's why I'm very happy to see the development that you are having, Arnab, with your center at the MRC and Niadvani, with the UNESCO. And I think it's very key to look at it in a systemic and educative manner. My second point will be shorter. Once we've understood that the issue is systemic, and until we move back to actions in the international community which are systemic, let me comment on what I see in the international community seen from the position you've been introducing me as our think tank being a member of working groups of the G20, through its engagement group with the think tank, that is the T20, and through its engagement group with the business, because we work with companies, with consultancies, that is the B20. So from this point of view, what I observe and working with some UN organization is I realize that what you were mentioning, Commodore Das, that potentially the UDA might be able to connect with the 17 SDGs, this potential is untapped. When you look at the funding mechanisms in the world, when you look at all the programs, when you look at all the studies or the origination studies, those studies to originate projects, to originate pipelines of projects, you don't have this interconnect between the SDGs, and you rarely or never see the UDA. And even in those countries which are massively having their ecosystem impacted by the proximity to the sea or to an ocean, you don't have that much. You still have the same call for tenders, you still have the same programming, you still have the same ways of funding based on what we know, which is the technologies we know, which is the funding mechanisms we know, and not so much of innovative. So as said, my second point would be shorter. I'll stop with one recommendation, which is that once you've installed your partnership with the UNESCO at the end of a very great journey, and once you've centered your partnership with UNESCO on systemic thinking and on education and on percolating your message on UDA framework into the industry and actors, then at that time, please, my recommendation is to engage with the community of funders, with the and banking and funding at large, the community of policymakers at the national level who are these days having a large part of their bandwidth absorbed with deploying all the successive steps of the Paris Agreement, which is good. The Paris Agreement has a country write NDC, nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement, then NDC implementation plan, then NDC investment plan, then NDC finance strategy. Please engage, and this is my recommendation, at MRC, engage with those countries which do that, because the UDA framework should be present at every step of this. They shouldn't do in silo, deploying the Paris Agreement, and then trying to see later how to connect with the UDA framework. And the last recommendation within this main recommendation of engaging with actors, I think that technologies which exist on the UDA, and I'm much less of an expert, so I'm speaking under your control, need to be developed. As far as I understand, the tropical waters are very unique and particular, but technology transfers from tropical areas to the rest of the world has to happen, because some of those technologies already exist. And some of these technologies that already exist, I'm sure, are not known by the large so-called global centers of the global north. I subscribe to what you said at the point, Arnab, that we should downplay this divide between the global south and the global north or whatever, because we have one global ocean, but still, I would humbly put that those new developments call for understanding what happens in tropical water from the scientists who work on tropical waters based in tropical countries. And this is not new, because when we're talking about NDCs, and this is my very final point, in NDCs, when you want to measure the impact that your country will have on the planet, on the CO2 in the atmosphere, you need to address the storage capacities of your ecosystems, of your soil ecosystems. And for that, we have specific equations. We have equations that are specific to each country. The way a tempered forest absorbs carbon is not the same in the tropics. And those models we had for long, which are called pantropical models, just don't work. Because from each and every agro-ecological climatic zone, the absorbing capacity is different. So on those topics, the so-called North has started lessening on the scientific developments from the so-called South. I think for the sea and for the oceans, it ought to be the same. And you play a great role in that. You're at a great position. And it's been my honor and privilege to be able to think aloud with your friends once more. Thank you for the invite.